What if the foundation of absolute power wasn't some glorious victory, but the ultimate humiliation, a secret so shameful they've tried to bury it for centuries? A story where the god whose name was synonymous with thunder was defeated. He was taken apart like a machine, the most vital component ripped right out and left in the dark hollow. We're used to thinking of Zeus as the pinnacle of power, a god whose whim was law and whose wrath was a death sentence. We picture him on his golden throne on Olympus, clutching thunderbolts that could shatter mountains. His voice, the very crack of thunder that shakes the heavens. He is the victor, the patriarch, the absolute monarch of the cosmos. But what if I told you there was a moment, one horrifying, shameful chapter in the annals of the gods that they've spent ages trying to rip from the history books and burn? A moment when the almighty king of the skies wasn't just beaten, he was humiliated, mutilated, and broken. When like a helpless beast he was dragged into a damp, stinking cave, and his power, his very divine essence, was literally ripped from his body and stolen. The Thunderer, whose name made mortals and immortals alike tremble, lies on the cold stone, crippled and powerless. His lightning bolts, which just yesterday had turned entire armies to ash, are beyond his command. His booming voice, which shook the foundations of the world, has fallen silent. The monster that defeated him had done the unthinkable. It had sliced open the goddess' divine flesh and ripped out the sinews from his hands and feet, not mere mortal tendons, but shimmering, humming cables of pure power, the physical embodiment of his dominion over the heavens. These threads, woven from raw electricity and will, were coiled like blood-soaked ropes, tucked away in a bearskin bag like some ghoulish trophy, and Zeus himself, the father of gods and men, was left to lie in the darkness, powerless, humiliated, dismantled like a complex machine with its mainspring torn out. He was alive, but he was hollow. How could this have happened? What creature in the universe was capable of such a thing? To understand the depths of this downfall, we have to rewind the clock to the very dawn of the Olympians' reign. Zeus's victory was no sure thing. His throne was forged in the fire and blood of a multi-generational war that shook the very fabric of reality. This wasn't a single battle. It was an age of total war. First came the war with the Titans, his own aunts and uncles, the primordial forces that had ruled the world before him. These weren't gods as we know them. They were the elements made flesh, mountains that could walk, oceans with a will of their own, time itself embodied in the cruel Cronus who devoured his own children. For 10 years that war raged, and the skies turned black with smoke as the earth groaned from its wounds. But the younger generation of gods, led by Zeus's cunning and fury, came out on top. The Titans were overthrown and hurled down into the deepest, darkest pit of creation, Tartarus. It seemed peace had finally arrived. But the peace was short. Mother Earth Gaia, whose Titan children now languished in the abyss, did not forgive her grandchildren for this victory. Her grief and rage gave birth to a new army, the giants. These weren't just big men. They were monsters born from the drops of blood that fell to earth when Cronus castrated his father Uranus. They were a vengeance made flesh, creatures with shaggy heads and serpents' tails for legs, whose roars were the rumble of earthquakes. And so war broke out again. The Olympians, now battle-hardened from the last war, clashed again in a death. With the help of their mortal children, like Heracles, they won again. The giants were annihilated, their bodies becoming new mountain ranges. Their death rattles the echoes in the canyons. Zeus had secured his power once more. He had defended his throne twice. He was on top of the world. And that's where his hubris got the better of him. He thought he had broken Gaia's will. He was dead wrong. 2 lost wars hadn't tamed her. They had distilled her maternal grief into pure, concentrated hatred. She had lost the Titans. She had lost the giants. Now she had nothing left but a fury as black and bottomless as the cosmos itself. And so she took one last, desperate, monstrous step. She turned to the one power that was older and more terrifying than the gods themselves. She descended to the gates of Tartarus, not just the prison where her kin were held, but the very essence of the abyss. For Tartarus was not a place, it was a being, a primordial terror, the consciousness of the void, Gaia's own brother. And in the embrace of this living nightmare, in the union of earth and the abyss, she conceived her final child, her ultimate weapon. He wasn't born, he was erupted from the bowels of the earth, a volcano of pure hate. His name was Typhon, and he was unlike anything the world had ever seen. He was a creature of such colossal size that his head scraped the stars, and his outstretched arms could touch the sunset in the west and the sunrise in the east. From his shoulders grew 100 serpentine draconic heads, and each spoke with its own voice. One would hiss like a viper, another roar like a lion, a third bark like a pack of hounds, a fourth bellow like a bull, and sometimes they would all merge into a single, inhuman scream that made the gods' blood run cold on Olympus. Fire blazed from his eyes, hot enough to incinerate stone. Instead of legs, he had gigantic coils of hissing snakes, and his entire body was covered in black bristles and feathers that stood on end. The last, desperate scream of Gaia, summoned not merely to defeat Olympus but to wipe it from existence. And it was this creature, this hurricane of flesh and fury, that marched on Zeus. They didn't see him first. They felt him. On Olympus, the mood that day was one of carefree celebration. After 2 grueling wars, the gods were finally letting their hair down. Nectar flowed like water, the music of Apollo's lyre mixed with Aphrodite's laughter, and Olympian Hephaestus was handing out new goblets polished to a mirror shine. Suddenly, the strings on the sun god's lyre snapped with a dry, pitiful twang. Laughter died in their throats. The wine in their cups rippled as if from an unseen tremor. The marble floor beneath their divine feet began to shake, subtly at first, then more violently, until all the tableware on the banquet tables began to rattle. Ares, the god of war, instinctively grabbed his sword. Then came the sound, not a single noise, but a legion of sounds fused into a monstrous cacophony. The barking of 100 wild dogs, the roaring of enraged bulls, the hissing of a million snakes, and the roar of a lion so powerful it seemed the very pillars of the palace would crack, and above it all, an inhuman, piercing shriek that twisted the soul. The gods rushed to the edge of their glittering home and looked down. What they saw made eternity freeze in their immortal eyes. A shadow was creeping across the world, devouring the light, and the source of this darkness was a creature rising over the horizon. Its torso was taller than the highest mountains, and its outstretched arms looked as though they could embrace the entire world, only to crush it in a death grip. The 100 serpent heads on its shoulders thrashed about, and from each mouth spewed fire, setting the horizon ablaze like the dawn of the apocalypse. Panic gripped Olympus, not the fear of battle that Ares knew so well, not the awe before a mighty This was a primal, existential terror, the kind that order feels when faced with absolute chaos. This was a creature that had no place in their ordered cosmos. It was a mistake, a glitch in reality itself, and it was coming for them. Hermes, the swiftest of the gods, was the first to break. His winged sandals flashed, and he plummeted from Olympus like a stone, but even in his fall his body twisted, transforming into a sacred ibis that flew far away to the distant lands of Egypt. The others followed his lead. Apollo and Artemis became a crow and a cat. Aphrodite turned into a fish and dove into the deep waters. The war god Ares himself, forgetting all honor, turned tail and fled as a boar into the forests. Even Hera, queen of heaven, took the form of a white cow and bolted in a panic. In moments, glittering Olympus was deserted. The banquet tables were overturned. Nectar spilled across the marble. Only one remained, Zeus. He stood on the precipice, the wind whipped up by the monster's approach tearing at his chiton and beard. There was no panic in his eyes. There was rage. The rage of a king whose home had been defiled, whose family had been sent scattering in fear. The rage of a creator facing down embodied destruction. He had defeated the titans. He had exterminated the giants. Was he, the lord of all creation, going to let some overgrown serpent destroy everything he had built? In his clenched fist, a thunderbolt was born. First, a spark, then a ball of lightning, then a blinding spear of pure energy, humming and crackling with power. In his other hand, he took up his most fearsome close-quarters weapon, the adamantine sickle, the very same one that had once been used to overthrow his own forefather, Uranus. With a thunderous war cry that answered Titan's 100-headed roar, Zeus charged into the fray. The battle shook the foundations of the world. The thunderous bolts struck with a precision and force no natural storm could ever match. They sliced off the monster's dragon heads by the dozen, and they fell hissing to the earth, leaving smoldering craters behind. Typhon roared in pain and fury, hurling entire mountains he'd ripped from their roots at Zeus, but the god dodged them with the ease of the wind. At first it seemed like history was repeating itself. Zeus was pushing the monster back. He wounded it so badly that its blood gushed onto the earth, giving rise to an entire mountain range that mortals would later call Himusta Bloody Mountain. Drunk on success and his own power, Zeus decided victory was at hand. He could see that Typhon was weakening, and then hubris, the eternal enemy of gods and men, whispered in his ear, "Finish him. Get closer and kill the beast with your sickle, just as your father once did to his." It was a fatal mistake. Zeus dove downward, raising the glittering adamantine sickle over his head, ready to deliver the final, decisive blow. And in that instant, the earth beneath him exploded. The giant serpent coils that served as Typhon's legs shot up from the ground with impossible speed, ensnaring the god's body. It was a trap. Zeus was in the steel trap grip of 100 slippery, muscular bodies. He struggled to break free, but the coils only tightened, their crushing grip. While the monster's 100 surviving heads descended in a claustrophobic onslaught, they bit and spat venom and fire, their deafening roar shattering his will to fight. In one moment, Typhon tore the lightning bolt from Zeus's hand and cast it aside. In the next, it knocked the adamantine sickle from his grasp. And then, pinning the helpless god against the rock, the monster did something no enemy of Olympus had ever dared to imagine. Taking that very divine sickle in its clawed hands, Typhon didn't kill Zeus. It decided to take him apart. With a sickening crunch and a flash of blinding light, it sliced through the flesh of the Thunderer's arms and legs, and from the wounds, as if from severed high-voltage cables, it began to pull out his sinews. Shining, pulsating threads of divine power woven from thunder and will. Zeus couldn't even scream. The sacrilegious violation of his very essence. He could only watch as his might, his very ability to move, his dominion over the heavens, was literally ripped from his body, becoming a bloodied yet still glowing bundle in the victor's claws. When it was over, Typhon tossed the limp, mutilated body of the god aside. It hefted him onto its shoulder like a hunter's trophy and carried him to the deepest, darkest cave it could find, the Critian cave in Cilicia. Dumping the powerless king on the damp stone, the monster returned to the light. The stolen power, those humming ropes of might, it wrapped in a bearskin and entrusted to its sister, the serpent maiden Delphina, monstrous dragoness, who dwelled in those parts. It was over. Silence fell on Olympus, and in a dark, damp cave, humiliated and broken, lay a god who could no longer lift a finger. And in that silence, broken only by the steady drip of water, a new feeling was born in Zeus, one he had never known: absolute, total helplessness. He whose will moved the constellations now couldn't even brush a woodlouse from his cheek. The lord of the cosmos lay stewing in his own humiliation, while anarchy bared its fangs at the world. Without Zeus on the throne, without his punishing and ordering hand, the cosmos itself began to fray at the edges. Winds blew without purpose, rivers reversed their course, and the sun and moon seemed to have lost their way, wandering aimlessly across the sky. Typhon didn't want to rule, it wanted to ruin, and the world, deprived of its guardian, readily succumbed to the destruction. And on a desolate Olympus, fear began to curdle into shame. One by one, the gods shed their animal disguises and timidly returned to their defiled home. Their footsteps echoed through the empty halls where laughter once rang. They saw overturned tables, spilled nectar frozen in crimson pools on the marble, and most terrifying of all, they saw the empty throne. That throne, always a symbol of unshakable power, now gaped like an open wound in the heart of creation. Ares clenched his fists, cursing his own cowardice. Apollo stared in despair at his broken Kythora, a symbol of the harmony now lost. Even Hera, whose jealousy and grudges against her husband were legendary, now looked at his vacant seat with a cold dread, realizing that without him, everything would collapse, including her own status. But what could they do? Throw themselves at Typhon and be slaughtered, or resign themselves to the eternal tyranny of chaos? It was then that a figure stepped from the shadows, one many considered little more than a trickster and a scoundrel. Hermes, not a god of war, not a god of wisdom, but the god of deceit, theft, and fleet-footed speed. He alone was paralyzed by neither fear nor shame. His mind, accustomed to finding backdoors and loopholes, was already firing on all cylinders. He understood what the others didn't. Typhon had made a mistake. It hadn't destroyed Zeus. It had left him alive, and that meant it had left hope. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply nodded to Athena, in whose eyes he read a silent approval, and vanished into thin air. His mission was insane at its core: infiltrate the monster's lair, find the stolen power, and return it to its rightful owner. This wasn't a battle. It was the heist of the century. The Critian cave was not just a fissure in the rock. It was a maw, exhaling a primordial cold and terror. Guarding the entrance was Delphine, Typhon's sister, a monstrous serpent maiden whose scales were hard as diamond and whose gaze could petrify the will of anyone who dared draw near. Hermes knew brute force was useless here. He called upon the only being whose gift could match his cunning, the goat-footed god, Pan. While Hermes, cloaked in mist, slipped along the cave walls like a silent shadow, Pan, hidden in the thickets above, took a deep breath and let out his infamous shriek. It wasn't just a sound. It was the very essence of panic, an irrational terror that defied all logic. Delphine, whose monstrous nature had never known fear, felt a jolt of confusion for the first time in her life. Her serpentine head whipped toward the source of the sound, her senses momentarily overwhelmed by the sonic assault. That instant was all Hermes needed. He slipped into the depths of the cave. There, in the darkest corner, on a pile of stones, lay a bundle wrapped in bed. Even through the coarse fur, a faint, pulsing radiance emanated, as if a captive storm heart beat within. The bundle smelled of ozone, blood, and divine power. With his heart in his throat, Hermes unwrapped the skin. There they lay, the sinews of Zeus. They no longer looked like bloodied ropes. Now they were conduits of pure, condensed light, humming softly like power lines before a storm. Carefully, as if carrying the world's most fragile treasure, Hermes wrapped them back up and, without a second's delay, slipped out of the cave, leaving a bewildered Delphine to listen to the fading echo in the mountains. Restoring the power was no less agonizing than losing it. Hermes and the wise Athena, bent over their father's crippled body, began their unthinkable task. It was like performing surgery on the soul of a god. They threaded the glowing filaments back into the torn flesh, Each connection sent convulsions racking Zeus's body and blinding flashes of energy that lit up the cave. But then, the final conduit was reconnected. For a moment, there was silence. Then Zeus slowly bent a finger. Then he clenched his hand into a fist. In his eyes, until now empty and dead, the first spark ignited. It blazed into a firestorm of fury the likes of which the world had never seen. He rose. Not as he had before, not with the arrogant confidence of a ruler, but with the grim resolve of one who has been to the abyss and back. The humiliation hadn't broken him, it had forged him. And this is where the story splits in two. One is the secret, shameful version. The one the gods buried as deep as they could, the story of panic, flight, humiliating defeat, and a secret rescue mission carried out by a god of thieves. And the other, the official story. The version for mortals, for the history books, for eternity. The one later recorded by the poet Hesiod, who basically became Olympus's chief PR man. In this version, there is no defeat, no Kavi, no stolen sinews. In it, a mighty Zeus, without so much as flinching, confronts the monster alone. The battle was short, furious, and glorious. The thunderbolt incinerates its 100 heads in a single volley. The monster, without even a chance to strike back, is vanquished and put to flight. It wasn't a war, it was an execution. Simple, swift, and proof of the absolute supremacy of Olympian order. This version was beautiful, inspiring, and, most importantly, safe. It left no doubt as to the power of the gods and gave no reason to question their right to rule. But you and I, we know the truth. Restored, but forever changed by the ordeal, Zeus began the second battle. This time, he didn't rely on pride alone. He armed himself to the teeth. He took not only his lightning bolts, but the very same adamantine sickle that had been turned against him. He hunted Typhon across the world. The battle raged over mountains and seas. But now, Zeus was in no hurry. He was methodical, cold, and ruthless. He wounded the monster, wore it down, drained its strength, cornering it like a seasoned hunter corners his prey. The final showdown took place off the coast of Sicily. There Zeus cornered his foe. But instead of merely killing it, he decided to make it an eternal reminder. Gathering all his power, he lifted an entire mountain, the colossal Mount Etna, into the air and brought it crashing down on Typhon. Burying it beneath millions of tons of rock, he didn't kill it. An immortal cannot be killed, he imprisoned it. And to this day, when Mount Etna smokes and erupts, those who know say it isn't geology at work. It is the rage and hatred of Typhon, thrashing in its eternal prison and spewing fire upon a world it could never destroy. So which of these stories is the truth? The one that speaks of an infallible, all-powerful deity whose victory was preordained and effortless, or the one whispered in secret, the one that tells of fear, of failure, of humiliation, the story of a god who was vulnerable, who lost, who was literally taken apart, but found the strength, albeit with a bit of help, to get back up and claim his revenge. One story offers us a sense of security and a belief in an unshakable order. The other offers a far more unsettling, but perhaps more vital idea. Even gods have scars, and perhaps true strength isn't about never falling, but about finding the courage to rise again every single time. The choice of which version to believe, as always, is yours.